When I watched this film, I thought to myself, wow, a movie about a politician who, on at least one issue, actually evolves in his thinking. Was that part of the appeal for you, Rob, in bringing this story to the screen?
I have a different take on it.
Okay.
I mean, I don't think he evolved. And this is, we've had long discussions. We've all had long discussions, but I've spent time talking to Doris Kearns Goodwin about this, who worked with Lyndon Johnson. And, she went down to the ranch and wrote his biography, worked with him on it. Also, Bill Moyers, who was his press secretary, and Ben Barnes, who was a lieutenant governor of Texas, who spent a lot of time with Lyndon Johnson. You cannot do what he did in terms of not just civil rights, but the voting rights, Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, all these programs that he put together. You don't do that on a dime. You have to look at Johnson in a bigger picture, in a bigger light. He grew up in poverty. He grew up in the hill country of West Texas, and he knew what poverty was. He taught at schools, impoverished schools, and so when he put forth this war on poverty, the Great Society, you don't just cook that up. You don't just turn on a dime and do that. That's something that has to be somewhere in your DNA. It may have been pushed down, and it certainly was, because he knew, he was also a consummate politician, and he knew what could get done and what couldn't get done. But the antecedents of that had to be there somewhere. And he never thought of himself as a Southerner. He never did. He thought of himself as a Texan and a Westerner.
Right.
And he was more than happy to take on the mantle of being a Southerner if that would help him broker deals. Like he says in the film, I'm the only one who could speak Southern and Kennedy. Now, I don't know how much he spoke Kennedy, but he was able to broker deals, and he knew how it worked. And when he was screaming in there about, you put this bill on the floor of the Congress, it will never become law, he knew that for a fact. And we had an interesting conversation with some journalists that I found out after the fact, because that was an argument too. Could Kennedy have ever passed it, or did it take Kennedy dying and the consummate knowledge of how to work the Congress like Johnson did? And I talked to some reporters who did cover the Capitol Hill at the time. They said no way in a million years would it have ever gotten out of committee, the Civil Rights Act. And Johnson knew that it couldn't get passed. But I would suggest that you do not spend the amount of political capital that he spent in order to get it done. He knew he could get it done once Kennedy died, because like he said, you're fighting two presidents now. And he figured that out. But he also knew he was going to spend an enormous amount of political capital to get it done, meaning he was going to lose the Southern Democrats. And he said it for a decade. And it turns out it's more than 5 decades. And so you don't do that lightly, knowing full well that that could happen to you and it could actually sink your presidency. So I don't think he turned on a dime. I think his the political landscape, he evolved with that. But I don't think he evolved in terms of what he thought was right at a certain point in time.
Matt, I'm intrigued to ask you, as someone who's not from this country, what do you make of the kind of decades of partisanship that we learn, in this film were going on then, are going on now? How do you find it all?
I mean, this moment in history was an incredible moment in history. What's going on now is just getting worse and worse. And I think this film, obviously, you can look at it and see a president who could get things done. And I think that's what, in retrospect, we all look back at Johnson and see one of his great strengths. So, it's a hard question for me to ask, like, how do what's my opinion of what's going on now? I mean, it's fucking crazy. Right. And I think many Americans feel that. And I don't think Rob feels that way. I think he loves what's going on.
No, I mean, if you have checked the Twitter account, I'm pretty even keeled on this subject.
But, look, it's pretty evident what's going on now. But, obviously this all drew us to this material and this president. He was one of the great presidents who, ultimately got in too deep with Vietnam, but was, pure politician and could get stuff done.
Liz, I want to ask you about Woody Harrelson because I feel like this is one of the best performances I've ever seen him give. And I thought to myself as I was watching it, wow, he must have just been the epitome of focus on the set. And then I saw a video on James Marsden's Instagram today of him in full LBJ makeup and wardrobe, basically doing this dance boogie.
Yeah,
So,
I think.
so what was he like?
I think he did a lot of research for the role, and he studied Johnson's recordings, which the library had, and he really, he became Lyndon Johnson. He transformed himself. But he's always good-natured and fun to be around, and nothing got too heavy on the set ever. We had a really good time with him.
For Tim and Trevor, were you guys particularly intrigued as brothers by the fraternal relationship between Bobby and John Kennedy? Because that, to me, was very eye-opening, to see the rifts between the two of them and their differences in thinking. What was it like to explore that with this film?
I don't think I ever really thought about that.
Yeah, actually, I don't think I did either, actually.
But it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think Tim and I have always been drawn to the Kennedys in particular. Actually, I was long more interested in Bobby and Jack before Johnson, and I think I think it was in a Robert Caro article. It was an excerpt from his most recent book in the New Yorker that really got me thinking about this guy in a different light. I think there's something quite Shakespearean about both Johnson and his relationship with the Kennedys, and the Kennedys' relationships with each other, which was really interesting to explore as we started developing it.
Yeah, and I imagine it must have been very difficult. I mean, Jeffrey Donovan does a great job as JFK. I don't know the actor's name who played Bobby. He's great. Those are
Michael Stahl David.
Those roles must have been among the hardest to figure out how to cast, I would imagine.
I mean, yeah, I think that it's always one of the most daunting things, really, when you're producing a movie about, JFK and Bobby. Is just, how do you cast the actors who are sort of not going to be, just cheesy or sort of make people laugh at them, really, if we're trying to play these people who sort of everyone knows so well, and the accents and everything. And I think both of them just, we feel nailed it, in every way.
I mean, Jeffrey wore the back brace every day. He was obsessed with the back brace. He was
even
He
on
lost
the
the first
suit,
one.
he always had it on. Yeah. And I want to just say something about Tim and Trevor because they developed the script with Joey Hartstone, who's a terrific writer, and Liz Glotzer says to me, you should read this, I mean, and I said, I don't want to make a movie about LBJ. I mean, I hated the guy. I was of draft age, during the Vietnam War, and that's all I thought about him, I think he's a bad guy. I thought more about him, and I thought, okay, I've spent time in politics and policy. I work in California government. I can see it was like a tale of two presidencies. If you didn't have the Vietnam War, you'd have one of the great presidents of all time. You can't separate it, but legislatively, except maybe next to FDR, probably the greatest ever. But what I really liked about what these guys did, and you just mentioned it, they saw this article. It was by Caro in the New Yorker, and it was this sliver of time. It was basically about what happens to this guy when he has to assume the presidency, and the pressure that's on him to become president and take over from a beloved president and somebody who he felt he could never live up to. They would never love him. They would never accept him. And that's what I thought was the window into why to do this. Because to me, if you want to do a biography of Lyndon Johnson, you're going to need 10, 12 hours on Netflix or Amazon or something to really explore it. But I said, who is this guy? Who is this guy that had these two presidencies? And one I hated and one we all have come to love, and we've all benefited from these programs. And that was the window in. That little sliver there said, okay, a real personality of a guy comes out when he's under the most pressure, under the most difficult circumstances. And the Doris Kearns Goodwin book gave us a couple of real clues as to who he was. One was he had a recurring nightmare of being paralyzed. And I thought, that's interesting. Here you got a guy who's, everybody thinks he's an arm-twisting bull in the china shop. He gets what he wants. And look at this. He's feeling paralyzed. And then the other thing was his relationship to his mother, which was conditional. His mother, he felt his mother wouldn't love him unless he was doing the thing she wanted him to do. And so he felt at times unloved and was unsure of that. I said, that's who this guy is. And that's what I think the public doesn't know about this guy. So we had all that, and I think it was the finiteness of the time frame that allowed us to explore that, because otherwise it kind of gets lost in you know, all of that. So I think that's what makes it work.
And I'm sure you all noticed in the credits, this was shot on location in D.C., New Orleans, and Dallas. Tim and Trevor, are there restrictions that Dallas puts on a film production when you want to shoot the motorcade route? Are you allowed to shoot the actual route, or do they limit that?
So we did actually shoot the real route. I mean, it was definitely a little bit complicated, and we actually shot the whole thing in, I mean, I want to say like 5-6 hours.
It was
five
Dealey Plaza.
hours, you know.
Yeah,
Well,
5 hours. And we shot right there at Dealey Plaza. And I had to call the mayor of Dallas because they weren't going to give us that. And he said that you can have it for 6 hours because they don't want it tying up traffic for the whole day.
I believe it was 8, but you shot it in 6.
Oh, that,
Well, they had told you, because 3 weeks prior, that James Franco show on Hulu had shot there,
It was 9.
forever.
and they just ruined it. I think the city was like, we can't let this happen again, and we had already scheduled our shoot, and they were like, sorry, guys.
The point is, we had a very short window, and I had 4 cameras, and so I thought, well, in the time that we have to reset all the extras and reset the motorcade, maybe I could get them to go 3 times around, you know? And I figured, well, that's 12 angles, so that should be enough. And then we very carefully picked the angles that we wanted, and we got everybody ready. And we actually dressed the guy up to look like Abraham Zapruder and gave him a camera. It's a digital camera, but you couldn't see he was off in the distance. And he stood exactly where Abraham Zapruder was. And if you notice in the film, you know, when the car comes out from behind the sign, that's a shot that you can see in the Zapruder film. And the thing that's interesting about, I don't know how many people have been to Dealey Plaza, but what's interesting about it is, first of all, it's tiny when you think about what happened, you know, the monumental thing that happened there. But the other thing is, there's always these history buffs and conspiracy buffs. They're all there. They're always there, no matter when, whether it's a production or not. So you got like built-in consultants, you know. No, the umbrella man stood over there. The babushka lady was over there. And we had a lot of people telling us.
Well, I thank all 5 of you for being here, and I
you.
congratulate you on this film.
everyone.